would like to be able to see your faces. Feel free to move up. There's a big sort of swath in the middle of the room where there are no people, so move to the front of the class, please. Feel free. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome back to AUP our dear colleague and friend Richard Beardsworth. Richard is currently the E.H. Carr Chair and Head of the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University. I looked on YouTube today to find out how to pronounce that word. Aberystwyth. Aberystwyth? Say it again. Aberystwyth. University in Wales, where he was named Lecturer of the Year in 2015. His visit coincides with our January board meeting, so we also welcome tonight in the audience a great many of AUP's board members, some of whom will remember Richard from the days when he was a faculty leader at AUP. Well before Wales, at the beginning of his very distinguished career, Richard spent nearly 20 years on our faculty, where he was hired into the Department of Comparative Literature by Dan Gunn, who's also in the audience. He eventually succeeded Dan as co-chair of comparative literature himself. A political philosopher, Richard moved on to chair AUP's philosophy program within the Department of European Cultural Studies, and he was a true global nomad at AUP, eventually joined the Department of International and Comparative Politics, where he taught at the undergraduate and graduate levels and played numerous leadership roles on the faculty. Respected and beloved by colleagues and students alike, he was voted AUP's Distinguished Professor of the Year in 1995 and was nominated for this distinction 7 other times. While at AUP, he published Derrida and the Political, his first book, his book on Nietzsche, and he began, I believe, and actually I just confirmed that he published his important book on cosmopolitanism in one of his last years at AUP. Recently, his work has focused, through the lens of international ethics and politics, on articulating forms of political responsibility and leadership that respond to global challenges in order to do 2 things: to counter both regressive nationalism and global elitism. He's currently working on 2 books. He's co-editing The State and Cosmopolitan Responsibility for Oxford University Press and preparing a 2nd book, Political Responsibility in a Globalized, Fragmented World. Sounds familiar? Also for Oxford. And Richard's scholarship also takes the form of activism. He regularly organizes workshops with academics, politicians, and policymakers on political responsibility and leadership. As part of a 2-year speakers series on Brexit, sponsored by my office over the past 2 years, I've invited Richard to speak to us today about the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union and what this says, in Richard's own words, about the contemporary loss of politics. So I want to thank you, Richard, for coming back to AUP to take part in our institutional debate on Brexit, and we hope that everybody will stay afterwards. Richard will also take questions, and then in the next room we're going to have wine and cheese for everyone, and I hope you'll have a chance also to speak to him personally then. So thank you for coming, and Richard, please take the podium.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks to Celeste for this invitation, both as president of AUP and also as a friend. And she has been a friend at a moment for me of personal difficulty. And Celeste has this wonderful technique, I think it's a skill rather than a techniques, of sending very short emails, but which are extremely important and to the point. And so I thank you as well. This will take about 30 minutes. I think it might take a little bit more, but as soon as you hear the word conclusion, it's 2 minutes. I want to start with 3 excerpts. The first excerpt is, if you can't hear me, just say go back to the microphone. Someone, you
back to the mic.
I should say, it's wonderful to be back at AUP. This place is growing, and it's very important that it does grow. 3 excerpts, and the first is an observation. Last week, when Emmanuel Macron rented the Bayeux Tapestry to the Brits, he spoke for an hour with one of London's top journalists, Andrew Marr. You can see it on the BBC iPlayer, Andrew Marr show. His English was perfect, and most impressively, his body language worked with his English. Difficult. In a marvellous display of, and I use this term knowing several of you are committed to it, cultural translation. The following day, Theresa May stood outside number 10 with Emmanuel Macron and said to the press, of which there were the French press, "Bonjour." And that was it. And that is it. Second excerpt. Quote. Today, too many people in positions of power behave as though they have more in common with international elites than with the people down the road, the people they employ, the people they pass on the street. But if you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what citizenship means. Theresa May, UK Conservative Party Conference, September 2016, 3 months after the Brexit referendum. Third excerpt. 3 days after the Brexit referendum, again, Theresa May, Brexit means Brexit. Quite brilliant comment. My order of points in the following half an hour or so. 1, I want to outline major arguments for Brexit under the banner of take back control. 2, I then want to give a quick sketch of what has happened since the referendum and how things have unfolded in such a way as the basic dilemmas of this Brexit argument are undermined, and that those dilemmas have not changed for 18 months and will not have changed since the beginning. 3, I will then situate the contemporary loss of politics, firstly in these dilemmas, and secondly at a deeper structural level of which the Brexit vote and the continuing aftermath of the June 2016 referendum are precisely symptoms and distractions. My order of points is strategic. I'm not going to argue against Brexit here, although I remain a Remainer. And as we have seen from the last week's events, in regard to popular sentiment, nothing is yet decided. I wish to untie, rather, the very argument for Brexit in order to show how it both reproduces and is a product of political chaos. In the Greek sense of the word, a yawning gap or void. So I don't want to use the word chaos rhetorically or overstate the mess. I'm using it in the sense of a yawning gap. And in fact, my title, which got slightly abbreviated in the move over the English or the French channel, whichever one you want, Out of Control, Brexit Chaos and the Contemporary Loss of Politics. Okay, so number 1. The argument for Brexit, take back control. The Leave campaign was not doing particularly well in the first 4 weeks of the referendum campaign. That was focused on economic policy. Not that the Remain campaign was either, but relatively speaking, all polls indicated a more than 5-point margin in favour of remaining in the European Union. In the last 2 weeks of the campaign, things became much more even, with the focus shifted to immigration and a brilliantly concerted effort in campaign terms on Brexit's desire to govern itself. Take back control became in those last 2 weeks the Brexit mantra. I would like first to look at what this means for the 2 main pillars of Brexiteers, the former industrial working class and a Eurosceptic elite, since it is under this mantra that these two sections of society have come together to form a socio-political bloc. So, the first reason, resistance to further EU integration and the political model of European federalism. As British Eurosceptics on both sides of the Commons, left and right, reiterated for years prior to June 2016, a historical moment is coming when the UK will have to decide whether it is part of the emerging European political project or not. We should recall that UK entrance into the European Economic Community, the EEC, in 1973 was specifically on trade terms, not that the political project had yet emerged explicitly. European functionalists were keeping it buried under the convergence of regulatory ties. But the UK was clear in its initial commitments. Margaret Thatcher's own commitment 15 years later to the single market was consistent with this classical liberal focus on trade, just as both Conservative and Labour governments' national rewriting of the 1992 Maastricht Treaty kept Britain out of the Eurozone. The focus on trade then, and this is important I think, in Brexit has always been more than the economic. It's always been part of a political refusal of a post-national political union that straddles the European continent and the English Channel. The recent film Dunkirk, directed by Chris Nolan, a brilliant and opportunistic piece of cultural mythology, makes it clear that this stretch of water is only traversable by Brits, neither Nazi power nor a European polity. 2. A specific understanding and definition of democracy accompanies this resistance to European integration. Those taking back control refer to the demos of the nation state. For Brexiteers, the political organisation and representation of the British peoples cannot be shifted to a higher level of governance without undermining both the efficiency and legitimacy of democracy. There could be a whole lecture series, Celeste, on this vast historical and theoretical point, and I think many in this room could contribute to it very interestingly. But let me, with the time that we have, foreground a couple of points only. For Brexiteers, the political principle of the European Union, the principle of subsidiarity, to take decisions where most effective and legitimate with regards to those affected by the decision, the principle of subsidiarity is either amoral or immoral. It undermines the cultural integrity of British laws, British customs, and British institutions, foremost Parliament. Hence, besides the political federal project, there is strong resistance to European regulations, European budgets, and European court jurisdiction. And hence, strong resistance on the part of leavers, both in London and in the regions, to the inevitable 2 years of transition, if not more, after March 2019, when the UK formally, it is said, leaves the Union. Brussels is in sum not simply full of undemocratic elites who don't pay proper taxes. The very principle of shared or pooled sovereignty endangers the moral concept of one of the first nation states of the world, the United Kingdom. The moral and political stakes are therefore huge at this moment in history, and one would be very unwise to underestimate them, as I think many cosmopolitan liberal Remainers have. 3. As intimated above, the switch to a small majority for the Leave argument was, I believe, among many others, decided with the move from economic interests to immigration in the last 2 weeks of the referendum campaign. There has been much commentary, especially with the US election of Trump following the Brexit vote, on the way fear of the other was mobilized for election purposes. This commentary is continued when we read about the generational and cultural divide between the young and the old, the urban and the rural, the university educated and the non-university educated, the elite and common sense. As if the question of immigration presents the litmus test of new cultural wars, an analysis common, of course, in the US since Hunter's 1991 Culture Wars, the struggle to define America, but now emergent in Europe in response to the failures of domestic and international liberalism. I put there to one side the question of Islam and terrorism. While there is pertinence to this commentary, and I come back to it later when discussing the politics of liberalism more generally, it should not be overstated regarding Brexit. It should not be overstated, I would argue, regarding Brexit. At present, a small minority fears the dissolution of the British people under conditions of economic interdependence, as is the case in all Western European countries, although this minority has already become a small majority in Eastern European countries, like Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. Most seek controlled immigration and wish their state institutions to be able, whilst abiding international law on refugees, to choose who enters the country to work and secure welfare benefits. In brief, uncontrolled immigration, as they name it, is destroying the social contract. The immigration argument is accordingly less one of us versus them, although it is there and it can very quickly escalate into that. And racism, of course, plays a part in that escalation. It is less one of us versus them than one of the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. This is another important point in the leader's argument. Now let me come back finally to trade in the take-back control agenda. It is the argument that had and continues to have least suasion, but it is a vital part of the argument for control. It is fundamentally a historically situated free trade argument, one unconvinced by the successes of collective bargaining. And this for two major reasons. One, the contemporary shift of economic power eastwards means that better terms of trade lie outside the geographical area of Europe, whatever the present terms of trade between the UK and the EU. 45% exports to the EU, 53% imports from the EU into the UK. The UK, secondly, the UK's economy, and this is important, the UK economy's comparative advantage lies in services. Not just financial and legal, and we always hear about the city. Not just financial and legal, but also those of the information industries, artificial intelligence, and what one could call the bioservices. That is to say, genome research and synthetic biology. Collective bargaining through the EU and the 27 national economies it will represent presents a severe disadvantage, it is argued, for export-led growth in the area of these services. Brexiteers argue accordingly for a bespoke deal with the European Union, a Canada plus, because in free trade terms, they are aware that EU countries need these services for the management of their own economies. For example, the City of London for the raising of cheap capital, future automation systems, specific manufacturing parts within an extended supply chain, but also, and very importantly, the contemporary servicification, terrible word, but you know what I mean, servicification of commodities in general. The negotiating threat of no trade deal and the assumption of WTO rules is used from this perspective to ask Europeans, or Brexiteers, what they want from the UK, and not only what the UK wants from the EU. I believe that these four basic arguments for Brexit provide a best-case scenario, and as I have said, one cannot ignore them. Or one does to the disadvantage of the polity. Rather, however, than offer specific criticisms of or responses to them, I want now to show how in working themselves out over the last 18 months, these arguments have been persistently punctured by a set of dilemmas that they constitutively cannot overcome. And that as a result, politics has reverted through Brexit to a question of denial, distraction, and division. It is not that this reversion is unprecedented in politics, of course not, and one could argue that is politics. But the fact that these dilemmas are known by almost all not to be solvable, and that nevertheless government and the established parties, including Labour, see fit constantly to hedge any public vision of how to go forward, confirms that Brexit, at least for me it confirms, that Brexit constitutes part of a deeper problem that is precisely not being addressed through it, hence the essential distraction, and hence, I would argue, the essential lack of control. Second part, reality since the referendum and the basic dilemmas. All events since the referendum, up to and including the parliamentary vote on the withdrawal bill in December 2017 and the present makeup of the UK negotiating team for the resumption of talks in Brussels this March, all events betray a deeply divided country and a deeply divided governing class. The split between Leavers and Remainers renders both the Conservative and Labour parties dysfunctional, turning an essential element of politics, compromise, into a politics of denial. Don't look there, it's a yawning gap. Chaos. Since the Conservative Party is in government, its dysfunctional nature is on display for all to see. But the same will be the case if and when Labour take power and form a government. Intellectual and media focus precisely on the politics of identity. Some of you will disagree with me later on this one. Social liberals against social conservatives and so forth make this split presently unending in the public sphere. Okay, well, just one side note there. However eloquent Theresa May is, she made it to phase 2 of the negotiations with the European Union. And from this very narrow perspective, that is a true political success, which is why she could sideline in her last cabinet reshuffle future contenders to the premiership, like Rory Stewart, who is a friend of AUP, so effectively in her recent placing of him to one side of a major cabinet ministerial role. Very interesting move, yeah. She's sidelined the up-and-coming pretenders. So she wants to sit there for quite a long time, as she did in the Home Office. As several commentators and politicians have noted, most recently former Prime Minister Tony Blair, in a call for the political centre, there are basically 4 options up for negotiation in an essentially divided nation-state. 1, to rethink and stay in a reformed Europe, where the Brexit vote is used as leverage to achieve reform. 2, to exit the political structures of the European Union, but stay in the economic structures of the single market and customs union. 3, to exit both the political and economic structures of the European Union, but try to negotiate a so-called bespoke deal which recreates the existing economic benefits and keeps us close to Europe economically and politically, at least politically, regarding the lower politics of security cooperation in defence and intelligence. 4, to exit both political and economic structures and negotiate a free trade agreement, aspiring to be something else than Europe. And here the common garden varieties across the political spectrum are the following: British Commonwealth 2, Global Britain, an independent social democratic state, and socialism in one country. Options 1 and 4 are without dilemma, but are represented by a minority. Options 2 and 3, the common ground of contemporary UK politics, enact the dilemmas repetitively. Either the UK is in the single market and customs union and accepts the obligations that come with it, for the moment, 4 freedoms, European court jurisdiction, European budgets, and regulatory alignment, or it does not. If the UK does not wish to stay in the single market and customs union, then it cannot ask for economic preference on any issue, including services, in front of the other 27 member states negotiating with themselves. Any elements of a bespoke deal would rather be the result of hard trade-offs, and that looks the way it'll be, between the two parties over several years, between 5 and 8 years, not 2. So if you're worried about your British citizenship, you folks who are also British like me, don't worry. So any elements of a bespoke deal would rather be the result of hard trade-offs between the two parties over several years. It cannot be a comprehensive negotiating position now, which is why Donald Davis cannot present one. He cannot present a vision, and nor, despite her Florence speech, can his Prime Minister. Options 2 and 3 are accordingly false options. These false options came into clear outline when the border issue of Northern Ireland deferred the ending of phase 1 of the negotiations at the end of last year. If the UK government does not want a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, then free movement of people between the two nations is necessary. This requires that Northern Ireland be part of the customs union. The border would then have to be between Northern Ireland and the rest of the union, which would be the end of the UK nation-state as such. Either, therefore, the UK as a whole remains within the customs union to guarantee territorial continuity on the island of Ireland, or the whole of the UK leaves the European Union and a hard border returns to a line between the two parts of Irish territory. And that could obviously foster a great deal of potential violent conflict again. If the United Kingdom wishes to remain territorially united as a nation-state, it is either in the customs union and therefore accepts the principle of subsidiarity, so it will no longer be a nation-state in its own terms, or it exits economic and political structures completely. The UK cannot, as we've been hearing, have its cake and eat it. Or in liberal terms, if it wants rights, it must accept responsibilities. Good liberal point. Options 2 and 3 are not just false alternatives, they are irresponsible politics, I would argue, that most recurrently fail to form a common ground. Now, all this suggests that the split within the Conservative and Labour parties is impossible to mend. Whatever hedges and fudges are now rehearsed before a final deal is on the table. From the referendum result up to now, I would therefore argue that Brexit is literally out of control. Before concluding this section, and it's important, let me say that this is not just the irresponsibility of the UK government and political parties, and I am, as you will be aware, constantly including Labour in this irresponsibility as the official parliamentary opposition. the EU could have differentiated the basic principle of the four freedoms within the single market after the results of the Brexit referendum, but chose, for apparent purposes of its own institutional survival, and one well understands that, not to do so. Since, in other words, the single market remains a homogeneous bloc, the UK can in reality only be in or out. UK frustration with EU intransigency is here not misplaced, but it is predicated on the classical doctrine of free trade, an economic analysis that misrecognizes how continental political vision works. Brexit chaos and the contemporary loss of politics. The contemporary loss of politics has been understood so far in the sense that a politics of hedging, based in turn on a politics of fixed identities, young, old, city, country, socially liberal, socially conservative, highly educated, not highly educated, that a politics of hedging has replaced a politics of compromise and transformation of the common. I suggested at the beginning that this loss of politics covers over something deeper from which Brexit as a whole enacts a distraction. Let me now take this point up. The loss of politics must more fundamentally be understood in terms of the loss of a common good. The Greek philosopher Aristotle was the first to argue, at least in the Western political tradition, that the polity was founded on the common good, and that humans, in distinction to other animals, were able to invent this good, which is why precisely he called us political animals. It is this common good that has been lost in Western democracies, and the hedging of Brexit rehearses, point by point, this loss, like the presidential victory of Trump in the United States. Now, the reasons for this loss are many, and I will not bore you with my own analysis of the decline of globalization narratives and the rise of populism. There are nevertheless two reasons of import to this talk. Radical inequality in the developed countries and the liberal politics of identity of the last 30 years. Now I'm going to push it. On the first, processes of financial and economic interdependence, together with the development of the global south, have created enormous domestic inequality in the developed countries. This, as the data of global inequality expert Branko Milanovic shows, is in fact the most decisive shift in power to the east. Those blessed by the welfare state after the Second World War, in what we still call precariously the developed world, are now being expelled from the social contract precisely because they are fundamentally uncompetitive in a truly global economy. The big winner of globalization include those in China, India, Vietnam and Indonesia who have seen sizable income gains from a relatively low base, and those in the highest income brackets in the industrialized world. Less the top 1%, it is argued, than the top 0.0001%. The losers are found in the bottom half of the income distribution in North America, Europe and Japan. Recent analysis strongly suggests that the economic effects of artificial intelligence will only exacerbate this problem. This is historically unprecedented, and no politics is yet addressing it responsibly by reinventing how we understand and operationalize the common good. Whether it be a sub-state formation like Scotland or Wales, a nation-state like the United Kingdom, a federal state like the USA, or an aspiring regional polity like the European Union. One policy suggestion out there's a lot of talk about it at the moment in the policy community, certainly in London, is a basic minimum income for all. But there is no conception of a common framework within which this policy would be shared collectively. Work would have, for example, to be devalued. which in a growth-led market economy like the UK, and remember the second argument, yeah, remains, for the moment at least, a total contradiction in terms. The economy would, for example, have to have already moved to the guiding principle of low-carbon sustainability for this re-evaluation of the dignity of work and the consumerism, not particularly dignified, that accompanies it to happen. No one, apart from the Green Party, no one in the UK is addressing it in policy terms. This basic reason for the contemporary loss of politics, as rehearsed by Brexit, is made worse, I would argue, by the contemporary politics of identity. Now hear me out. I understand identity politics as not only the personalization of politics, the personal is political, but also the focus on single issue agendas. Politics becomes accordingly, and as we saw with the Hillary Clinton campaign, a question of abstract rainbow aggregations, a formulaic commonality that does not win you elections. As the Columbia academic Mark Liller has argued regarding the US, identity politics undoes not only the common good, but citizenship as such, whatever one's identity. Now, I don't want to argue with the struggles for collective rights within identity politics. They have been very important since the 60s. But I agree with Liller that such struggles have come at the cost of losing politics as the art of the common. This art, to forge the common, requires time, experience, skill, and delegation. Something that a digital public sphere also puts in question, as we all know so well. Brexit, the repetition of its dilemmas and its politics of hedging by both main parties, is both a symptom of and a distraction from our present inability to forge anew the common as a common political experience. That is why nationalism is here. Until we can, if we can, the chaos of Brexit, the yawning gap, long after Brexit, will remain. Conclusion. Right, a couple of comments to conclude, but a more telling lecture would begin here. There is and will be much academic analysis in the coming years regarding the analogy between now and the 1930s. Are both domestic and international liberalism being undone after the liberal euphoria of the 1990s? Have the failures of Western liberal interventionism sealed liberalism's own fate? Do modernization processes necessarily lead to a political middle class, or are new forms of populist nationalism and authoritarianism as much humanity's political future as a stalling liberal democracy? Is the early 20th century mix of domestic inequality and the relative decline of empires or hegemonies repeating itself today? At the very least, one can say that the 1990s Whiggish history, the contention that the human species is on a path of ever greater liberty and enlightenment, is at an end. I'll leave the other questions for another time. There is, however, a major difference between now and the 1930s, one which is both material and ideational, one to do with matter and to do with ideas. Whatever our political forms, the human species faces major and in some cases existential planetary threats, whether it be nuclear proliferation and the risk of a nuclear detonation in spite of the logic of deterrence, which has held up pretty well, whether it be climate change and its devastating consequences for both human and non-human life, whether it be both climate and economic migration. The UN predicts at present at least 60 million migrants moving from Africa to Europe in the next 65 years. 60 million. Or whether it be regional to global health pandemics and the attempt to control disease. The scale of these material threats require, case by case, the pooling, if not cession, of state sovereignty. Despite, accordingly, the present failures of domestic and international liberalism and the re-emergence of the national prerogative, our shared community of fate is outstanding. The oft-made analogy with the 1930s breaks down precisely here. It is my belief that these global and/or planetary threats will either drag us forward into new political inventions of government, of democracy, and critically the relations between national, regional, and global interests, or it will drag us back into a politics of fear before planetary threats. You can imagine the kind of narratives that can be organized around that. In this regard, there could be much worse than Trump after Trump. The chaos of Brexit, as I have rehearsed it, points in conclusion then to major economic, political, research and educational challenges. If not addressed appropriately enough, take back into control. These challenges will lead at best to a recurrent politics of hedging and at worst to new forms of political violence and war. Historically, the first tips easily into the second. The empirical and, for me, theoretical chaos of Brexit is in this sense huge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for that extraordinarily complete and totalizing vision of our present historical moment and dates. May I invite some questions from the audience? Yeah, it's hard to kind of know where to come in there. Who's going to be the daring one who asks the first question? Yes, please. Dan Gunn, Professor Dan Gunn.
Richard, you also added, you sort of added educational at the end as a possible remedy. But as you know, educational is one of the much under discussed but most threatening aspects to go with Brexit, and not to mention what's happening in the States. So how do you get education back in to your, if your narrative is not just going to be one of total bleakness, how do you sneak education back in when it's precisely that that's going to be hit perhaps more, as much as anything else, by Brexit?
I'm not absolutely sure, because I think one of the hard trade-offs that will be made is going to be around science and research with the European Union Commission. And I think a lot of the research grants, so Britain monopolizes the research grants in Europe. It's quite brilliant at grant capture, particularly within the Horizon 2020 round. There's been so much representation of the universities to government in the last few months that there is, around that, I think there is a shift going on about how that is negotiated. So even though I think post-Brexit, if there is Brexit, even if universities are going to have to rethink their European market, and they'll obviously, it's clear where universities are going. They're going, they're obviously already in China. They're going to deepen China, and they're going to India. And India is very interesting because India, and I'm not distracting from your point. I do understand the politics of distraction, and I won't commit it myself. India is very interesting because they need sort of about 750 universities in the next 10 years to be able to educate their emerging middle class. And they ain't going to do it. They're just not going to do it. So at the moment, there's an extraordinary educational policy there of both organizing, exchanges, networks with universities, and also creating a digitized university public sphere. Britain will move on India, particularly East India and Southwest India. which is where universities are most missing. And there's a lot, I've been through the stats because I have to as a head of department, I've had to look because it also affects the department that I'm presently directing or probably more banally managing now. So I'm a little, on two fronts, I'm a little, I actually think, I don't think there's a dilemma there. I think that there's a hard trade-off there to be had. But the question I think you're raising, which is, are the UK universities committing suicide at the moment? And does the Brexit sort of put the knife in the back? And I think it's very uncertain. I think it's very uncertain. I'm just not sure. I think there will be some academics who would respond to you in a much more detailed way and would agree with you. I can't yet. I think from, my university, Aberystwyth University, I do see quite a lot because I sit on the senior exec. There are ways of negotiating this. But the question of the educational challenges, I think, is very interesting. And I think it's very, I've just been to the southern states in the US to try and get exchanges with some of the southern universities because there's far too much attention to either the West Coast or to Chicago or to Golden Triangle. And it's really interesting going into some of those universities, down in South Carolina or Georgia, and talking, going into Baptist colleges, And I think there's a lot of educational work to do, to talk to these people. I don't want to ignore them. I don't want to, and I do think that's an educational challenge. And I think one of the ways to go forward is really to start rehearsing arguments with the very people who don't agree with you. And I think that's a challenge for liberalism. That's not a great response. I hear you, but that's where I would start.
One of the things that you've said over and over is Brexit if it happens. Now, how could it not happen today? You've got two sides. It's nice for England to say, I want to do something else, or England to do that, but I don't see how you can undo Brexit now. And yet you've hinted that that's a possibility at least 4 or 5 times tonight.
God, as many as that.
Yes.
Yeah, that shows you where, right.
I think even more than that, by the way.
Well, and the if is if. I think it's clear, and it's certainly become clear in the last month, that if public sentiment, and it has to be at that level, and of course how you poll public sentiment is itself an issue, because the polls got it wrong around the Brexit referendum. But if public sentiment, basically expresses itself in polls which are constantly being taken across, seems to be a range of about 6 polls, which have a lot of credibility at the moment, because they got the general
These are
election
English
right.
polls, so you're not talking
These are
about
British
Europe.
polls.
Yes, that's one side. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm talking. So I'm talking from the side of Britain. We can then talk about from the side of the EU, but there I think it's fairly clear what Donald Tusk and Michel Barnier have said, as Emmanuel Macron said when he was in London, which is, we don't want you to leave. They said it very clearly. So I think from the EU side, the top negotiators and the top political executive power is saying, Britain, stay with us. So for me, it's the Brit side that's the real question. All I'm saying is, if public sentiment scored above 60% for about, I think it would be a month or 2 months, then either the government in power would begin to rethink what exactly the terms of the parliamentary vote would be on the negotiations' final deal, and the parliamentary vote, that parliamentary vote would, I think, change with regard to its representative powers, that is to say, the people that it represents. I think that could be one way. Another way, which obviously, people like Nigel Farage and others, well, perhaps not obviously, you haven't seen that, but people like Nigel Farage and strong Brexiteers like Rees-Mogg, they are arguing that a second referendum is on the way. Now, if you are hearing that, something is going on. Something is going on. It may be scare tactics. And so that's why I'm saying if 5 times.
Okay.
All right, but I'm very willing for it to be less because I'm not, as a Remainer, I think there will be Brexit.
Aren't there polls already that show 55%?
Not a moment.
I think I read that just this weekend. Maybe it's an odd poll. If there were a new referendum soon, what do you think might happen?
Well, Lee, great to see you.
Good to see you again, Richard.
I think the polls I've seen, the polls I've seen on aggregate, and I've looked at the average, it's about 52 at the moment. It's gone from 52-48 to the other way around. That is not enough to reverse a referendum decision, even though that referendum was an advisory referendum. Let's always remember that. It was not a decision. That's part of the Brexit dilemmas. Interesting. So, hey, it's got to get to above 60 for a continued period of time before people begin to move.
Way in the back.
Can you please expand on how identity politics and does the common good?
Sorry, I didn't hear
Can you
that.
expand on identity politics?
Can you please expand on how identity politics and does the common good?
Yeah, I'll just talk about my own experience. Hey, personal is political, so let me talk about my own experience. I'm totally contradicting myself as a result. It's very, I campaigned during the referendum. It was very interesting knocking on doors and talking to people, and I did that in South Wales and in Midlands. And what Americans would call progressive liberals, they basically, people wanted to remain within one specific issue with regard to Brexit, and they spoke of themselves in relation to their identity. And a couple of us have had conversations about this, feeling that with Brexit there's been a loss of identity. I believe very strongly that if you go that way, you are not able to go beyond your identity when you're looking at politics, and I think this is made worse by social media, given ghettoization. And where one is not able to think about the ability of a citizen to find common ground. And I think you see that every day in America, and you are beginning to see it now every day in the UK. It's the focus on a particular issue that is important to you personally. That has been so important for norm entrepreneurship. I think particularly of human rights. Whatever kind of rights they are, we can go to. It's been very important that the personal has been political, but I think it's been at the cost, and note my language, okay? It's not yes or no. It's been at the cost of thinking what is common between someone who is not in the least bit interested in what your issue is and yourself, and saying we are still a we. And no, the politics of identity is also a politics of othering. And that's the problem.
On either side, the liberal side and the conservative,
Yes,
Richard.
absolutely.
So, Richard, can I ask a question which is, clearly you've lined up your argument in a way that allowed you to sort of slip over to the United States very easily and talk about the situation in the US, the way trade and immigration were played off against each other also in the Trump election. And I know because of the way you presented it tonight, but also the way we spoke about it last night, that you actually see the positioning of Macron somewhat differently. So in terms of common good, in terms of citizenship, what's happening differently in France right now?
Well, many of you here are here, and you will know better than me. Because one of the things I've learned about going to the States and then going to the UK, after being here, is how important it is to be there, on the ground, embedded on the ground. And that's why in many ways I take the back control mantra very serious, because they're my neighbours in Aberystwyth. I think, Matt, we've partly spoken about that, but generally for everybody, I think Macron, from the very beginning, I remember, you know, the Beethoven scenario, which is there when he walked on stage at the what was it, just you know, the Jardin. I think Macron is brilliant at precisely doing what other politicians have become awful at, which is presenting political vision and making that political vision emotionally charged and a narrative. Yeah? And I suppose, you know, we go back there to the logic of identity politics, making a narrative with which one can identify. Yeah? And, you know, some of his reforms, personally, you know, there could be disagreement here. Some of his reforms are absolutely necessary. And I note, the first time I came here, it was Daniel Gunn who employed me. And I remember walking back one home month, I think it was in 1992, and you reminded me, you were here for a long time, Richard. Yeah? And just the whole of Paris came to a halt because of the strikes. Everyone came out and stopped. And Paris was basically taken ransom by that. Whether one agreed with the strikes or not, I think Macron has been able, one, to totally, I mean, you know, he's like Trump in that sense, and no wonder he can work with Trump. Yeah? He's been able to go through the middle without reverting to nationalism, with a cosmopolitan vision predicated on the notion of French citizenship, yeah, which ultimately is precisely that distinction between being a citizen and having an identity, be it the ethnic identity of a white French person. I think in that sense, it's extraordinary what he's done, and I think obviously a lot of European politicians are very grateful to him, and we'll see what Merkel is able to do with the possible new coalition. So he there is in the driving seat, but as you said to me last night, and I absolutely agree with you, you know, if he gets it wrong, there could be the worst again in France. Oh, yeah. And the worst would be those who have, not like UKIP, who just came up before the referendum and have now collapsed. Yeah? The Front National has been here since the 1980s, increasing its vote at each election. And therefore, you know, in a sense, even if one isn't in agreement with some of his economic reforms, and you know, some of the reforms that will take place also in in education and higher education, I think is extremely important for us, and that is where we are talking about the politics of the centre, to affirm that moment so that it can become institutionalised long term. Because the short-term alternative is very bad.
Yes, in the back.
This is more of a theoretical question to your argument. You discussed a lot about the shift in the common good, but could one not argue that that very idea of the common good since the inception of liberal democracies wasn't really the common good as we would like to perceive it as, and that it was inherently based on inequality. So therefore, this kind of rise of Brexit, Trump, may have been kind of inevitable in a sense because it's the building up of a shaky foundation. And if that is the case, then you talked about the reformulation of the common good. Is it not necessarily the reformulation, but the total deconstruction and then a rebuilding? And then also another question, is that feasible with the kind of competition right now going on between liberal democracies and the rise of authoritarianism?
And the rise of
authoritarianism.
Okay, you might need to come back to me on the second question. I think I slightly lost it. On the first question, well, we disagree. I mean, you know, I used to be someone in deconstruction. I wrote a book on Derrida and the political. I'm not there now. Yeah, I think a norm, even if it is the norm of the common good, is constantly undermined by political practices. Yeah? We know the very notion of American citizenship. Is still going on. And yet there in the Founding Fathers document is a very clear sense of what a citizen is. And it's that norm that still motivates political resistance to the American policy's translation of that norm for the last 300 years. So a norm can do a great deal of work even when it's inconsistent with the political reality of play. And therefore I would say to you, the common good is still a very important norm. And precisely for what you say, we need to do it better. Now, what you might say to me is, perhaps as a good deconstructionist, I don't know, all right? What you might say to me is, the common is never going to come back. That's the real chaos, Professor, or Richard Beardsworth, whatever. All right? That's the real chaos, and that's what you're not getting to. Yeah? And I fundamentally disagree with that analysis. And that analysis is very big on the left. You know? And it really began in France, you know, with what we call the post-structuralists back in the 1960s. You know? And I just think they've got it terribly wrong. And therefore it's really important to argue for a sophisticated liberalism at this moment in time. You know, and I'm not particularly a liberal, you know, but it's very, you know, the pragmatics of politics is outstanding. And I fear that your argument is far too general, okay, and that it might, let me say that, okay, very politely to you, it might distract you for what needs to be done. There am I, I'm an old Leninist, yeah? What is to be done? Second part of the question, you'll have to remind me.
It was just asking, well, you kind of, if you were to deconstruct that, is that even feasible in the time where there's this competition between liberal democracies and kind of the rise of authoritarian regimes?
Well, I mean, you know, that debate, I mean, you know, I think that China's going to get into enormous domestic problems soon, yeah? And, you know, we know it doesn't have a social contract, but they are brilliant at international relations. Absolutely brilliant. Some fantastic people advising the Communist Party. Yeah? Much more interesting than what's going on in Russia. Yeah? I'd say, you know, that whole question of liberal democracy and authoritarianism is a political struggle. And it has to be fought. And I'm very worried that those predominantly on the left, but also obviously on the right, who are undermining liberal democracy, yeah, are actually undermining the struggle that needs to be had. And in that sense, my pragmatics, you know, dare I say it, I might actually be close to Tony Blair here. Yeah? I think a politics of the centre is critical at this moment, just as it was in the 1930s, but the agenda of the political centre needs to be global challenges, embedded in nation states. That is phenomenally interesting as a way to think international order. And that's where I think the questions are, with all due respect.
In the very back.
This is just a simple housekeeping question. As an Englishman studying in Paris, how would the process be of me continuing to be in Paris? Say if I wanted to live here, would I have to get visa applications on the go? Will I have to change my life in terms of living here for free, effectively, as I'm doing now?
Yeah, I'm not a civil servant, so you're posing the wrong question to me. But what I do know from knowing one or two civil servants who are involved in the Brexit negotiations, it's quite clear that the question, the question of citizenship is going to be ongoing for the next 5 years. So I don't know, if you want to live here, they will make a deal whereby those who are already here, yeah, stay. The question will be probably 2020 or 21. From that date, there is going to be a series of regulations with regard to the restriction of residency and the restriction of benefits. All right? I'm a pragmatist. I mean, I don't think there's a problem at the moment, precisely because it's so appallingly negotiated. Incompetence is a strength in them.
Welcome to the world. We'll take one more, and then Mark, and then we'll have a drink together and discuss informally.
Richard, I love the common good perspective. It's hard to believe in it sometimes. And I want to get back to the first question that asked in a different way. Don't you think that this whole thing, and I'm not forgetting the political cowardice that it all is about, just to get 4 more years in 10 Downing Street, let's just settle for a referendum. It doesn't matter as long as I remain in my little nice apartment. So I put that aside. But don't you think it's a failure of education? We have a world that has failed educating the elite that they should not only be thinking about their interest and their greediness, and we have a world compared to the 1930s that is way more educated. The masses have had access to education, and they're just as stupid as they were before. Because with the identity track, what do? The same way as the elite, the same way as the rich, they only think of themselves. My identity, who cares about the Africans? You talked about the 60 million. We don't care about them. We just want our life to be nice, and we want our piece of the cake of the elite of the liberal Western countries.
Okay, I do think the common good is a very important political concept at the moment with regard to the shared community of fate of all nations. There is a shared community of fate, and globalization is not going to go away. Although the holders of it could well come soon from the global south. And of course, the social contract at a domestic level with regards to the international, it's phenomenally complicated, but it needs to be rehearsed and worked out. So just that aside, I'd want us really to talk a lot about the common good if we could, and we don't obviously have time. Mark, I know you didn't mean it. It was the way you came across, but I went from door to door. People who voted Leave, they're not stupid. Please, they're not stupid. Some of them are very intelligent, and they have made decisions with regards to the way in which they think their income and their public services have fallen. Now, of course, you could say that's austerity, and that's been basically neoliberalism for the last 30 years, since the Reaganite Thatcher revolution and the release of capital in the world after '78. And that's for sure. I would, therefore, before you make the educational argument, which is crucial, I'm a materialist in that sense. I would go back to economic policy and political economy. And as I did it, I would accept that. And I do think that when we are talking about discrepancy of inequality and irresponsibility, it is phenomenally interesting. And I think that, I'd like to talk with you more and learn, because when you look at the stats and the data, we really are looking at a Western elite in the industrialized countries that have become phenomenally wealthy. Much more wealth, the disparity is much greater than the 1930s, much greater. But we're talking about 0.001%. Now, of course, the 1% is also very high, and it may include some of us here, all right? That 0.001 is an economic problem first, and it has to be addressed economically. Within that, of course, there's a responsibilization needed, and I'm the first to argue for that. I'm writing a book about it at the moment. Of course, we would agree a responsibilization is needed. Now, perhaps go back to Dan's point, where he said, Richard, in the end, you're more of a pessimist than you think you are, because you're not going to get the education responding appropriately enough. I still think I'm an activist, I'm an optimist of the will, in Gramsci's sense, and I think politics is precisely about hope, and hope is about the future. At the moment, there is no future, and we've got to get the politics of hope back. Now, who the we is there, it can be deconstructed, and we need to be very vigilant. I absolutely would agree there, and there the common is very difficult. But I do think at this moment in time, and I think Macron serves as an interesting example of, it was predominantly political leadership that did it. It really wasn't from the ground upwards. I think there are real opportunities at the moment. I won't go into them. I can tell you about the opportunities I think that are there in the UK. And quite clearly, education is one of them where we do responsibilize. One last comment with regard to that. I think the servicification of commodities is a very difficult one to address politically. It means, I don't have a car anymore. I do, and as I was saying earlier, I crash it too much in Welsh lanes, which are very, very windy. And there are too many hills in Wales. But soon I won't have a car. Cars will be pooled, and just like I rent a flat, I'll rent a car, or like my shopping bag, I won't own a plastic shopping bag. Of course we won't. We'll rent one unless we're in the supermarket, or maybe we won't have a bag at all. I don't know, or we'll rent something else. We're going increasingly towards the servicification of commodities, and there the old industrial working class. Yes, it has to be re-educated and retooled. Yeah? And we know that in the UK and the US that is a primary political challenge. But for the moment, nothing is being done. All right? But, and that's partly my response to Dan, which I didn't go into. I'm part of a very powerless committee trying to get polytechnics back into the UK. We used to have universities and polytechnics. And polytechnics were about vocational training. Now, vocational training is the end point of all universities. It goes back to Dan's point. Yeah? Universities committing suicide. Yeah? To get vocational training and employability, market employability, into very specific kinds of higher educational institutions seems to be an absolutely crucial move. And I think that the German model is quite interesting. Yeah? So there are lots of things to talk about. Yeah? But what I would want to say in sum is I think we've got to say economic challenge first and then educational challenge as an analytic priority, but of course they move together.
On the economical side, since we are going to have more and more automatization, and we're going to have more and more concentration of capital necessary for that, the return on people who have versus the people who don't have is not going to slow down. So how do you see that converging to what you were saying previously regarding redistribution?
Yeah, I think, it goes back to the question of the common good. Is that actually we're seeing the end of the common good? That this is what politics has got to face. So, Beardsworth, don't try and reinvent the concept. Yeah? That's where I think my own position on this at the moment, and I'd love to talk with you. My own position is that I think it is domestic politics that has to decide what kind of social contract it can give with regard to the technological changes that are coming. And if it can't give that social contract, we will have a politics of the worse. And that's the scary. That's what comes after Trump is worse than Trump. What comes after May is worse than May.
So maybe the only way out is a responsibility going to companies like Google. Like they need to take responsibility. Otherwise, they will not have in the market themselves.
Well, with John Ruggie, when he, with Kofi Annan, started corporate social responsibility at the international level with regard to global inequality and global justice. I think that needs to come back again to the domestic sphere. We've lost it. So, we've lost what the French call les 30 glorieuses. And, that's where we've got to think the domestic and the international together. And I think, for my discipline of international relations, that is a major challenge.
So let's have a drink.